The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of the international terminal as Michael Big Shaq Williams made his way toward Gate B-23. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Standing at 6'3" with broad shoulders and a confident stride, Big Shaq naturally drew attention even before people recognized who he was. Today he was dressed in a navy blue tailored suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly, paired with Italian leather shoes that quietly announced their quality without shouting about it. Around his neck hung 3 gold chains of varying thickness, not gaudy or overwhelming, but certainly noticeable. On his fingers, several rings caught the light as he moved, including a championship ring from when he had invested in a basketball team that went on to win it all. Each piece of jewelry had a story behind it, representing milestones in his journey from a tough neighborhood in Philadelphia to becoming one of the most respected music producers in the industry. Big Shaq checked. His watch, a limited edition, timepiece gifted to him by an artist whose career he had helped launch. He was early as usual. Being on time was a principle he lived by, something his grandmother had drilled into him long before fame or fortune entered his life. Respect other people's time and they'll respect yours, she would say. That wisdom had served him well throughout his career. As he approached the first-class boarding line, he noticed a few heads turn. A teenage boy nudged his father and pointed discreetly. An older woman smiled warmly at him, the kind of smile that suggested she might be a fan of the artist he worked with. Big Shaq responded with a polite nod but kept to himself. After 15 years in the music industry, he had found the perfect balance between being approachable and maintaining his privacy. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" The gate agent's eyes widened slightly as she looked up from his passport and recognized him. "Oh, Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to have you flying with us today. We're boarding first class now, so you're right on time." "Thank you," Big Shaq replied with a genuine smile. He had never taken for granted the privileges that came with success, especially the ability to travel comfortably. He remembered all too well the days of long bus rides and cramped economy seats when he was starting out, traveling to small studios across the country to work with unknown artists who couldn't afford to fly him in. The jetway stretched before him as he made his way onto the Boeing 787. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant with a tight smile greeted him. Her name tag read Rebecca. Unlike the gate agent, there was no flash of recognition in her eyes, just a professional, if somewhat cool, welcome. "Welcome aboard. First class is to your left," she said, her gaze briefly dropping to his jewelry before returning to his face. Something in her expression suggested disapproval, but it was subtle enough that Big Shaq didn't dwell on it. Throughout his life, he had encountered all types of reactions to his success and how he chose to display it. Some people would always judge what they didn't understand. The first-class cabin was half empty, the hushed atmosphere a welcome change from the busy terminal. Big Shaq found his seat, 3A, a window seat with no one assigned next to him. Perfect. He had a 12-hour flight ahead of him to London, where he was meeting with a British singer-songwriter who was working on a breakthrough album. He planned to review some tracks, catch up on sleep, and arrive refreshed. As he placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, he noticed a businessman across the aisle watching him. The man gave him a respectful nod, the kind exchanged between people who recognize each other's success without needing to make a fuss about it. Big Shaq returned the gesture before settling into his seat. A different flight attendant approached with a tray of welcome drinks. "Sparkling water, champagne, or orange juice, sir?" she asked. "Sparkling water would be great, thank you," Big Shaq replied. He rarely drank alcohol on flights, another habit from his early days when he needed to be sharp for meetings as soon as he landed. As the flight attendant handed him his drink, she hesitated. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my nephew is a huge fan of Moonlight. That track you produced last year changed his life. He's an aspiring producer himself." Big Shaq's expression warmed. These were the interactions he valued most. Not the recognition of his wealth or status, but appreciation for the art he helped create. "That's really cool to hear. Tell him to keep at it. It took me 10 years of producing in a tiny apartment before I got my first big break." The flight attendant beamed. "I'll definitely tell him that. Thank you for being so kind." As she moved on to other passengers, Big Shaq took out his noise-canceling headphones and settled back into his seat. The cabin continued to fill with the remaining first-class passengers, a mix of business travelers, wealthy tourists, and a couple who seemed to be celebrating a special occasion. Through the window, he watched the ground crew loading the last of the luggage. His mind drifted to the meeting ahead in London. The young artist he was working with had raw talent but struggled with self-doubt. Big Shaq saw himself in the kid, the same hunger, the same fear of not being good enough. Part of what he loved about his job now was guiding these new voices, showing them what he had learned the hard way. That authenticity always cuts through the noise eventually. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed Rebecca, the flight attendant from the door, walking through the first-class cabin, checking that everyone had stowed their items properly. When she reached his row, her eyes again flickered to his jewelry, lingering a moment too long on the diamond ring he wore on his right hand, a piece he had designed himself to commemorate his first Grammy win as a producer. This time, the look on her face was unmistakable, a mixture of judgment and something close to contempt. Big Shaq had seen that look before. Some people assumed his jewelry was about showing off wealth. Missing that for him, these pieces were milestones, physical reminders of moments when his hard work had paid off against the odds. He decided to break the ice. Long flight ahead. London's supposed to be rainy this week. Rebecca's response was professional but cool. Yes, sir. The weather report shows rain for the next several days. Her tone suggested she was surprised he would know or care about something as ordinary as weather patterns. As she moved on, Big Shaq pulled out his tablet. He had 4 tracks to review before landing, and he wanted to make notes for the artist. Music had always been his refuge, the place where judgments fell away and only the sound mattered. He put on his headphones, letting the unfinished tracks fill his ears, his fingers already tapping out a rhythm on his armrest as he identified spots where the bass line could be strengthened. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. The safety demonstration began, with Rebecca and the other flight attendants demonstrating the use of oxygen masks and life vests. Big Shaq watched respectfully, making eye contact and nodding when Rebecca looked in his direction. His mother had taught him to always pay attention to safety instructions, no matter how many times he'd heard them before. Respect the people whose job it is to keep you safe, she would say. As the plane began to taxi, Big Shaq felt the familiar excitement of travel. Despite doing it so often, he never took for granted the miracle of being able to cross oceans in hours, of connecting with people and music from around the world. His life now was beyond anything he could have imagined growing up in a neighborhood where many people never traveled beyond the city limits. The plane accelerated down the runway, and that powerful moment of liftoff pushed him back into his seat. Below, the city grew smaller, its grid of streets and buildings transforming into a miniature model version of itself. Big Shaq watched until the plane banked into the clouds, obscuring the view. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin came to life. Passengers began to adjust their seats. Flight attendants prepared the meal service, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Big Shaq noticed the couple across the aisle toasting with champagne, their happiness radiating across the cabin. He returned to his music, but kept his volume low enough to remain aware of his surroundings. Years in studios had trained him to listen on multiple levels at once, to the music itself, but also to the environment around him. It was this awareness that allowed him to notice the shift in atmosphere when Rebecca re-entered the first-class cabin. Now wearing white gloves and pushing a cart with pre-dinner drinks, she served the other passengers first, working her way methodically toward his seat. Her interactions with everyone else seemed warm and attentive. When she finally reached him, her demeanor cooled noticeably. "Would you care for a beverage before your meal, sir?" she asked, her eyes once again dropping to his chains before meeting his gaze. Big Shaq removed his headphones. "Just another sparkling water, please. With lime, if you have it." As she prepared his drink, he could feel her forming judgments about him, assumptions based on nothing more than his appearance and the gold around his neck and fingers. It was a familiar feeling, one that success had changed but never completely eliminated. What Rebecca didn't know, what she couldn't know from just looking at him, was that each piece he wore represented not just success, but survival. The ring on his left hand was a redesign of his father's wedding band, the only thing he had left after his dad passed away when Big Shaq was just 14. The thinnest chain around his neck was a gift from his first mentor in the music business, a man who had believed in him when no one else would give him studio time. These weren't symbols of excess to him. They were his history, worn where he could see them daily, reminders of where he came from and the people who had helped him along the way. As Rebecca handed him his sparkling water, their fingers briefly touched. He noticed her slight recoil, subtle but unmistakable. Big Shaq simply smiled and thanked her, refusing to let someone else's prejudice affect his peace. Little did he know that this small interaction was just the beginning. The long flight to London was about to become memorable for reasons neither he nor Rebecca could anticipate. The real confrontation was still to come, and when it did, it would change both of their perspectives in ways they couldn't imagine. The plane had been in the air for about 40 minutes when the meal service began. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm glow, creating an intimate atmosphere in the first-class section. Big Shaq put away his tablet after making notes on the third track. The bass line was nearly perfect, but he'd spotted places where the young British artist's vocals could shine more if they adjusted the mix. The aroma of freshly prepared food filled the cabin as flight attendants transformed passenger trays into dining tables, complete with white cloths and real silverware. This was one of the luxuries of first class that Big Shaq appreciated most, the chance to eat a decent meal while traveling instead of the packaged sandwiches he'd survived on during his early career. Rebecca approached his row with practiced efficiency, still wearing those white serving gloves. "We have 2 options for dinner tonight," she announced. Herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables or beef tenderloin with mushroom sauce. "The salmon sounds great," Big Shaq replied with a polite smile. As Rebecca set up his table, she seemed to be making an effort not to look at him directly. She worked quickly, placing his silverware and napkin with mechanical precision. When she reached across to set down his bread plate, one of Big Shaq's chains clinked softly against his seatbelt buckle. The sound seemed to trigger something in Rebecca. She paused, her eyes now fixed on the gold chain, the thickest of the 3 he wore. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to obvious disapproval. "That's quite a lot of jewelry for a flight," she said, her voice just low enough that nearby passengers couldn't hear clearly, but loud enough that Big Shaq caught every word and the tone behind them. Big Shaq looked up, slightly surprised by the comment. In his 15 years in the music industry, he'd faced plenty of judgment, but rarely so directly from someone in a service position. "Excuse me?" he asked, giving her a chance to reconsider her approach. Instead of backing down, Rebecca continued, her voice taking on an edge of condescension. "I said that's a lot of costume jewelry to travel with. Wouldn't it be more comfortable to pack it away for the flight?" The assumption that his carefully selected pieces, each marking a significant moment in his life, were costume jewelry, felt intentionally dismissive. Big Shaq took a slow, deep breath. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "How you respond to disrespect says more about you than the person disrespecting you." "They're comfortable enough," he replied evenly. "I've been wearing them for years." Rebecca's eyebrows raised slightly. "Years? Well, I suppose that kind of flashy style is popular in certain circles." Her emphasis made it clear what kind of circles she was implying. Nothing flattering. A few passengers nearby had noticed the interaction. An older businessman across the aisle frowned, clearly uncomfortable with Rebecca's tone. A woman 2 rows ahead had turned in her seat, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Big Shaq was acutely aware of the attention. Throughout his career, he had learned that as a successful black man, his reactions were often scrutinized more heavily than the actions that provoked them. He had built a reputation in the industry not just for his musical ear, but for his unflappable professionalism in difficult situations. "I'd like to enjoy my meal now," he said quietly, but firmly. "Thank you." Rebecca's lips tightened into a thin line. She seemed almost disappointed by his calm response. "Of course. Enjoy your salmon." She turned to leave but paused, looking back at his rings. "You know, we had someone through here last month with similar jewelry. Turned out it set off the metal detector so badly at Heathrow that security had to pull him aside for nearly an hour." The comment was clearly meant to embarrass him, to suggest that his style choices would cause him problems. Big Shaq simply nodded, refusing to engage with the bait. "I'll keep that in mind." As Rebecca moved on to the next passenger, Big Shaq noticed the businessman across the aisle shaking his head slightly. The man caught his eye and mouthed what looked like, "Sorry about that." Big Shaq gave a small shrug in response, a gesture that said both "it happens" and "it's not your fault" in one movement. Turned his attention to his meal, determined not to let the interaction spoil his flight. The salmon was actually quite good, the fish flaky and well-seasoned. He had just taken a sip of his sparkling water when he noticed a different flight attendant, the one who had mentioned her nephew being a fan, walking purposefully toward him. Her name tag read Diane, and her expression was one of professional concern. She leaned down slightly when she reached his seat. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to check if everything is to your satisfaction with your meal." The question seemed genuine, but there was something in her eyes, a hint that perhaps she had witnessed or heard about Rebecca's comments. Big Shaq nodded. "The food is excellent, thank you." Diane smiled, relieved. "I'm glad to hear it. If you need anything at all during the flight, please don't hesitate to let me know personally." The emphasis on personally confirmed his suspicion that she was aware of the situation. "I appreciate that," he replied. As Diane moved away, Big Shaq noticed her stop briefly to speak with the purser, a senior flight attendant who oversaw the cabin crew. The purser, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, glanced in Big Shaq's direction with a thoughtful expression. Big Shaq returned to his meal, but the confrontation had left a familiar heaviness in his chest. It was a feeling he knew well, the weight of dealing with assumptions and microaggressions while maintaining his dignity. In the studio, his talent spoke for itself. In boardrooms, his success commanded respect. But in random encounters like this, he was still sometimes reduced to stereotypes in the eyes of strangers. He finished his meal in silence, occasionally making notes on his phone about the tracks he'd been reviewing. Music had always been his refuge, the place where he could channel both pain and joy into something transformative. Some of his best production work had come after experiences like this, moments when he was reminded that success hadn't insulated him completely from prejudice. As the flight attendants began clearing dinner trays, Big Shaq noticed Rebecca was now working in the business class section. Diane had taken over serving his part of the first-class cabin. The change seemed deliberate. The purser approached his seat once the meal service was complete. "Mr. Williams," he said quietly, "I'm Thomas, the lead flight attendant on this service. May I have a moment of your time?" Big Shaq nodded and Thomas continued, his voice low and apologetic. "A passenger mentioned there might have been some uncomfortable comments made earlier. I want to assure you that's not representative of our airline's values." The fact that another passenger had reported the incident, not Big Shaq himself, seemed to surprise Thomas. His eyes held a question. Why hadn't Big Shaq complained? "I've been dealing with assumptions about who I am based on how I look for most of my life," Big Shaq explained simply. "It comes with the territory sometimes." Thomas's expression was troubled. "It shouldn't, though, especially not from our staff." He hesitated before adding, "I should tell you that you've been recognized by several passengers. One of them is the wife of our airline's vice president of customer experience. She was sitting 2 rows ahead and heard everything." Big Shaq raised his eyebrows slightly. He hadn't been looking for special treatment because of his status, but the information explained the quick response from the crew. "I don't want anyone to lose their job over a comment," Big Shaq said firmly. "We all have bad days. We all make assumptions sometimes." Thomas seemed both relieved and impressed by this response. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Williams. Still, I want to assure you that we'll address this internally. Would you be willing to speak with Rebecca later in the flight? She's been informed of who you are, and I think there's an important learning opportunity here." Big Shaq considered the request. His instinct was to let it go, to retreat into his music and his thoughts for the remainder of the flight. But something about Thomas's sincere concern made him reconsider. Maybe there was value in having that conversation, not just for Rebecca, but for the next person who might face similar treatment. "I'd be open to that," he finally said, "but not as a celebrity talking to someone who's made a mistake. Just as 2 people having an honest conversation." Thomas nodded, clearly impressed. "Thank you. I'll arrange it once we're at cruising altitude after our meal service is complete." He paused. "For what it's worth, my nephew has every album you've produced. Your work with that young jazz pianist last year was extraordinary." Big Shaq smiled genuinely for the first time since the confrontation. "Tell him thanks. That album was special to me too. As Thomas walked away, Big Shaq reclined his seat slightly and looked out the window. Below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, its surface catching the last rays of the setting sun. There was something peaceful about being above the clouds, suspended between continents. He thought about the conversation to come with Rebecca. He wasn't looking for an apology, though he suspected that's what she'd been instructed to offer. What he hoped for instead was understanding, a moment of genuine connection that might shift something in how she saw the world. His phone vibrated with a text from the British artist he was flying to meet. "Can't wait to work with you tomorrow. Still can't believe this is happening." The excitement in those simple words reminded Big Shaq why he did what he did, why he endured the uncomfortable moments along with the triumphant ones. Music created bridges between people, experiences, and worlds. Sometimes so could honest conversations. He texted back a simple reply. "Believe it. You've earned this moment. See you tomorrow." Then he put away his phone and prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be an interesting discussion with Rebecca. Whatever happened, he was determined to handle it with the same grace and integrity that had guided him throughout his career, not because he had to, but because that's who he had chosen to be. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft blue glow as the overnight flight continued across the Atlantic. Most passengers had settled into movies or sleep, the hum of the engines creating a soothing background noise. Big Shaq had been working on his tablet for about an hour after dinner, making notes on the fourth track from the young British artist. This one had real potential, a haunting melody over unconventional beats that reminded him of why he'd gotten into producing in the first place. He saved his notes and stretched, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders from hunching over screens and mixing boards for too many years. The digital clock on his screen showed they were about 5 hours into the 12-hour flight. He decided to take a break and walk the cabin a bit to keep his circulation going. As he stood, he noticed Thomas, the lead flight attendant, speaking quietly with Rebecca near the galley. Her body language was defensive, arms crossed, shoulders tense, head slightly bowed. Thomas's expression was serious but not angry as he spoke. When he gestured subtly toward Big Shaq's seat, Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. She glanced over, quickly looking away when she realized Big Shaq was watching. Big Shaq pretended not to notice the exchange as he walked past them toward the lavatory. He could feel Rebecca's gaze following him, her expression now uncertain rather than judgmental. Something had changed. He suspected Thomas had told her exactly who he was, not just a passenger with flashy jewelry, but Michael Big Shaq Williams, the producer behind some of the biggest hits of the past decade. When he returned to his seat a few minutes later, he found a fresh glass of sparkling water waiting for him, along with a small note written on airline stationery. The handwriting was neat but showed signs of being written in haste. "Mr. Williams, Thomas has asked if you would be willing to speak with me when you have a moment. I'll be in the mid-cabin galley when you're available. Rebecca." Big Shaq folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't in a hurry to have this conversation, but he had agreed to it. He took his time, reviewing one more track before finally standing and making his way to the galley. Rebecca was organizing a beverage cart when he arrived, her back to him. He cleared his throat softly and she turned, her normally confident posture now hesitant. "You wanted to speak with me?" Big Shaq kept his tone neutral. Rebecca glanced around to make sure no passengers were within earshot. "Yes, thank you for coming." She took a deep breath. "Thomas informed me that you're you." Big Shaq raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I've been made aware that my comments about your jewelry were inappropriate and unprofessional," she said, her voice stiff with embarrassment. "I've been instructed to offer my sincere apologies." The formality of her apology felt rehearsed, as if she was reading from an employee handbook. Big Shaq studied her face, seeing not genuine regret but fear. Fear for her job, fear of consequences. "Is that really what this is about?" he asked quietly. "Being told who I am and worrying about your job?" His directness seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked rapidly, her professional mask slipping for a moment. I don't understand. Would you have apologized if I wasn't Michael Williams? If I was just some guy who saved up for years to buy himself something nice to celebrate a personal achievement?" The question hung in the air between them. Rebecca's cheeks flushed and she looked down at her hands, still wearing those white service gloves. I need to be honest with you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I saw your jewelry, I made assumptions about who you were and where it came from. Those assumptions weren't fair and they weren't based on anything real. She paused. And no, I probably wouldn't have apologized if Thomas hadn't told me who you are. I would have just avoided your seat for the rest of the flight. Her honesty, though uncomfortable, was refreshing. Big Shaq nodded slowly. Thank you for that, at least. Rebecca looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since their initial confrontation. I've worked this route for 11 years. I've seen celebrities, business leaders, royalty even. I should know better than to judge people based on appearances. We all make judgments, Big Shaq replied. The question is whether we let those judgments define how we treat people. A call button chimed somewhere in the cabin and Rebecca glanced over her shoulder. I should get that. Go ahead. We can continue this later. As she moved to respond to the call, Big Shaq returned to his seat. He had just settled in when Thomas appeared beside him, a tablet in hand. Mr. Williams, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to follow up on your conversation with Rebecca. We only spoke briefly, Big Shaq replied. She got called away, Thomas nodded. I wanted to personally apologize again for the incident. When Mrs. Chen, the VP's wife, informed me of what happened, I was mortified. He hesitated. She actually showed me who you were on her phone. I have to admit I didn't recognize you immediately, though I know your work. Big Shaq smiled slightly. I prefer it that way, honestly. In the studio, it's about the music, not my face. Well, your reputation in the industry speaks for itself, Thomas said. Mrs. Chen mentioned your foundation's work in music education, too. Her daughter attended one of your workshops in Chicago last year. This caught Big Shaq by surprise. The workshops were something he was genuinely proud of, bringing production equipment and industry professionals to schools in underserved areas, showing kids that careers in music went beyond just being the person on the microphone. That's great to hear, he said. Those workshops mean a lot to me. Thomas seemed to be weighing his next words carefully. Rebecca is actually from Chicago, too. South Side. So am I, Big Shaq replied, understanding starting to dawn. Different worlds, same city. Thomas nodded. She's been with the airline for almost 12 years. Started as a gate agent, worked her way up. She's usually one of our best. Everyone has off days, Big Shaq said, or moments when their assumptions get the better of them. True, but that doesn't excuse... Thomas was interrupted by his radio crackling to life. He stepped away to answer it, then returned with an apologetic expression. I need to handle something in business class. Would you mind if Rebecca joined you to continue your conversation when she's free? I think it could be valuable, for her especially. Big Shaq agreed, and Thomas disappeared down the aisle. Left alone with his thoughts, he took out his phone and pulled up a photo gallery. Pictures from the most recent workshop in Detroit. The images showed teenagers clustered around mixing boards, their faces lit with concentration and excitement as they learned to build beats and mix tracks. These moments, seeing that spark of possibility ignite in young people who rarely got told they could create something valuable. These were what mattered most to him now. More than the Grammy Awards, more than the platinum records, more than the first-class tickets and the recognition. He was still scrolling through the photos when Rebecca returned, hesitating at the edge of his row. Thomas asked if I could finish our conversation, she said, her voice less certain than before. If you're not too tired. Big Shaq gestured to the empty seat beside him. I'm wide awake. Time zones mess with my sleep anyway. Rebecca sat, keeping a professional distance. She noticed the photos on his phone screen. Are those your children? Big Shaq couldn't help but laugh. No kids of my own. These are students from a music production workshop my foundation runs. Her expression registered surprise. Your foundation? The Beat Forward Foundation. We bring music production equipment and professionals to schools that don't have funding for arts programs. He turned the phone so she could see better. This was in Detroit last month. Rebecca leaned slightly closer, looking at the images of teenagers learning to use equipment that most professional studios would envy. That's not what I expected. What did you expect? Big Shaq asked, his tone curious rather than confrontational. She hesitated, clearly weighing honesty against politeness. I don't know. Party pictures? Celebrities, cars? I have some of those too, he admitted with a small smile. But these are the ones that matter. A subtle shift happened in Rebecca's expression. The beginning of understanding replacing judgment. How did you start doing this? I grew up with no connections, no money for equipment. My first mixing board was salvaged from a school that was closing down. My music teacher saved it from a dumpster. He scrolled to another photo, students presenting their finished tracks to a panel of industry professionals. I always promised myself that if I made it, I'd create the opportunities I never had. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Thomas mentioned you're from Chicago, too. South Shore, Big Shaq confirmed. You? Englewood, she replied. Left as soon as I could. Never really looked back. The mention of Englewood explained something. One of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago, it had shaped generations with its challenges. People who made it out often carried invisible armor, sometimes manifesting as judgment toward anything that reminded them of what they'd fought to escape. When I saw your jewelry, Rebecca said suddenly, it reminded me of guys from the neighborhood who got money the wrong way. The flashy ones who'd show up with gold chains one day and be gone the next. She shook her head. I made an assumption based on my experience. I didn't stop to think there might be another story. Her candor deserved his own. Each piece I wear means something, Big Shaq explained. This thinnest chain? Gift from my first mentor in the business, man named Leon, who gave me studio time when no one else would. This ring, redesigned from my father's wedding band, only thing I have left from him. He died when I was 14. Rebecca's expression softened. I judged you without knowing any of that. We all carry our histories with us, Big Shaq said. The good and the bad. Sometimes they help us connect with people. Sometimes they put up walls. The cabin around them was quiet now, most passengers asleep as they crossed the Atlantic. In this peaceful moment, something genuine was happening. Two people from similar backgrounds but different paths finding unexpected common ground at 37,000 feet. I am sorry, Rebecca said, and this time it didn't sound rehearsed. Not because you're famous or because Thomas told me to apologize, but because I should have treated you with more respect regardless of who you are. Big Shaq nodded, accepting her words. That's all any of us want, right? To be seen for who we are, not who others assume we are. Rebecca stood, smoothing her uniform. I should get back to work. Thank you for this conversation. It's given me a lot to think about. As she turned to leave, Big Shaq had a thought. Hey, you mentioned you're from Englewood. We're doing a workshop at Harper High next month. If you know any kids who might be interested. Rebecca's face lit up with genuine surprise and something close to gratitude. My nephew, actually. He's always making beats on his laptop. Never thought it could be more than a hobby. Get his information to me before we land, Big Shaq said. I'll make sure he gets a spot. For the first time since they'd met, Rebecca smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I will. Thank you. As she walked away, Big Shaq felt the familiar satisfaction that came from turning a negative moment into something potentially transformative. It wasn't about making himself feel better or gaining praise. It was about the ripple effects, how one conversation, one opportunity, could change a life's trajectory. He settled back in his seat, returning to his music with renewed energy. The incident that had started with judgment was evolving into something neither he nor Rebecca could have predicted. And somewhere in Chicago, a kid with dreams didn't yet know that his path was about to widen because two strangers from his city had found common ground in the sky. The next few hours of the flight passed peacefully. Big Shaq managed to get some sleep, drifting off while listening to the rough cuts he'd been reviewing. He woke to the gentle sound of the breakfast service beginning. Through the window, he could see the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon, bands of deep blue and purple giving way to orange and gold. The overnight transformation of the cabin was always something he found fascinating. Flight attendants with fresh makeup and perfectly pressed uniforms moved through the space as if the previous day had been reset. Passengers emerged from sleep masks and blankets, some looking refreshed, others fighting the disorientation of crossing time zones. This time, it was Diane who approached his seat with the breakfast cart. Good morning, Mr. Williams. We have a fruit plate with yogurt or a warm croissant with eggs and cheese. Coffee or tea? Fruit plate sounds good. And coffee, please, black. His voice was still rough with sleep. As Diane prepared his tray, he noticed Rebecca working on the other side of the first-class cabin. She moved with professional efficiency, but there was a thoughtfulness to her interactions with passengers that hadn't been there before. Occasionally, she would glance in his direction, her expression no longer cold or judgmental but contemplative. Thomas appeared beside his seat just as he was finishing breakfast. "We'll be landing at Heathrow in about 2 hours, Mr. Williams. I wanted to check if everything has been to your satisfaction since our conversation." Big Shaq nodded. "Everything's been great, thank you." Thomas lowered his voice. "I wanted you to know that Rebecca submitted a formal incident report herself. That's very unusual. Normally these reports come from passengers or supervisors." "What does that mean for her?" Big Shaq asked, concerned despite everything that had happened. "It means she's taking responsibility, which will be noted positively, but there will still be a review process." Thomas hesitated. "Your input would carry significant weight if you were willing to provide it." Big Shaq considered this. He had no interest in causing trouble for Rebecca, especially after their conversation. "What would you need from me?" "Just a brief statement about the incident and its resolution from your perspective. You can email it to our customer relations team." Thomas handed him a business card with contact information. "I should mention that Mrs. Chen has already submitted a complaint on your behalf." This news surprised Big Shaq. He hadn't asked for or expected anyone to fight his battles. "I'll send something today," he promised. "Make sure they know I'm not looking for any disciplinary action." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That's very generous." He glanced over his shoulder to where Rebecca was collecting breakfast trays. She asked if she could speak with you again before landing, if you're amenable. "Of course," Big Shaq replied. After Thomas left, Big Shaq spent some time answering emails that had come in overnight. His assistant had sent over the schedule for London, studio time booked for the next 3 days, a dinner with executives from the record label, and a brief meeting with a music education nonprofit that wanted to partner with his foundation. He was deep in thought about the potential partnership when Rebecca appeared beside his seat. Without the serving cart as a barrier, she seemed smaller somehow, more human. "Is this a good time?" she asked. Big Shaq put away his phone. "Sure." She sat in the empty seat next to him, her hands folded in her lap. "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation last night. It made me think about some things I haven't confronted in a long time." There was an openness to her now that made Big Shaq curious. "What kind of things?" Rebecca looked out the window for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I left Chicago 20 years ago, right after high school. I was determined to never look back, never be pulled down by where I came from." She turned back to face him. "But I think in trying to distance myself from my past, I've been carrying judgments I didn't even realize I had." Big Shaq understood this all too well. Success didn't erase your past. It just gave you a different perspective on it. That's a powerful realization. When I saw your jewelry, I made instant assumptions based on people I knew growing up, people who flashed wealth they got through hurting others. Her voice was steady now, reflective rather than defensive. "I never stopped to consider there might be different stories, different paths. The easiest person to fool is yourself," Big Shaq said quietly. "We all have blind spots shaped by our experiences." Rebecca nodded. "I've prided myself on treating all our passengers equally, with the same level of service. But yesterday showed me that's not always true. I let old biases affect how I treated you, and that's not who I want to be." There was something powerful in her candor, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about herself that Big Shaq respected. It reminded him of an artist he'd worked with years ago, who had struggled to find her authentic voice until she faced the painful experiences she'd been running from. "You know," Big Shaq said, "in music production we talk about cleaning up the mix, finding those frequencies that muddy the sound without you even noticing they're there. Sometimes the most beautiful tracks come after you identify what's been distorting things all along." Rebecca smiled slightly at the analogy. "I like that. Cleaning up the mix." She took a deep breath. "I contacted my sister this morning, my nephew's mother. First time we've spoken in almost a year. I told her about your workshop program. This surprised him. You haven't been in touch with your family?" "Not really. Like I said, I left and didn't look back. My sister stayed in Englewood, married her high school boyfriend. I judged her for that too, if I'm being honest." Rebecca's expression was a mixture of regret and hope. "But her son, my nephew Kevin, he's 17 now. She says music is his life, that he's always creating beats on this old laptop of his." 17 is when I started getting serious about production," Big Shaq said, "still using borrowed equipment, working out of my friend's basement. She's going to send me some of his tracks. Would it be okay if I pass them on to you? Even if he doesn't get into the workshop, maybe you could just listen? Give him some feedback? The request was earnest, without any of the entitlement that often came when people discovered what he did for a living. This wasn't about Rebecca trying to leverage a connection. It was about her attempting to rebuild a bridge she'd burned long ago. I'd be happy to listen, Big Shaq said. And if he's got talent, we'll find a place for him. The workshops are competitive, but we always make room for passion. The relief and gratitude on Rebecca's face was immediate. Thank you. That would mean so much to him. And to my sister. A thought occurred to Big Shaq. You know, we're always looking for volunteers at these events. People from different careers who can talk to the kids about their paths. If you ever wanted to come back to Chicago, see your family, maybe share your journey. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. You'd want me there? After how I treated you, especially because of how you've responded since, Big Shaq said. These kids need to see that mistakes don't define you. How you handle them does. That's a powerful message coming from someone who's walked a similar path. For a moment, Rebecca seemed at a loss for words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I'd like that. I really would. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into London. Rebecca stood, smoothing her uniform. I should get back to work. Thank you for this conversation, for all of it. It's meant more than you know. As she turned to leave, Big Shaq had one more thought. Rebecca, he called softly. She paused, looking back. The necklace you admired? The thin gold chain? I started a tradition a few years back. After every major workshop, I have similar chains made for the students who really shine, who show not just talent but heart. It's a reminder that someone believed in them enough to invest in their future. The significance of this wasn't lost on Rebecca. The very jewelry she had judged as flashy was actually a symbol of mentorship and belief in the next generation. That's beautiful, she said quietly. Sometimes the story behind what we see is worth asking about, Big Shaq replied. That goes for jewelry, music, people too. Rebecca nodded, a new understanding in her eyes. I won't forget that lesson. As she walked away to prepare the cabin for landing, Big Shaq turned to look out the window. Below, the patchwork of English countryside was becoming visible through breaks in the clouds. He thought about the unexpected turns this flight had taken, how what began as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into something meaningful. In his years in the music industry, he had learned that the most powerful tracks often came from moments of tension resolved into harmony. This flight had followed a similar pattern, discord giving way to understanding, judgment transforming into connection. His phone buzzed with a text from the young British artist he was coming to work with. Just woke up. Still can't believe I get to work with the Big Shaq today. Been practicing my tracks all night. Big Shaq smiled as he typed his response. Get some rest. The best music comes when we're open to possibilities we didn't expect. Trust me on that. He put his phone away as the seatbelt sign chimed on. The plane began its descent toward London, and Big Shaq felt that familiar mix of tiredness and anticipation that came with international travel. But there was something else too, a sense of satisfaction that went beyond music or business. Sometimes the most important productions happened outside the studio, in those human moments when judgment gave way to understanding and new connections formed where none seemed possible. As the ground grew closer, Big Shaq thought about Rebecca's nephew and the ripple effects that were already in motion, all because two people from Chicago had found the courage to see beyond their first impressions and listen to each other's true stories. The landing at Heathrow was smooth despite London's typical morning drizzle. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and checking phones that had been in airplane mode for the past 12 hours. Big Shaq remained seated, in no rush to join the inevitable crowd in the aisle. Through the window, he could see ground crew moving efficiently in their bright yellow vests, positioning the jet bridge and unloading luggage. London had always been one of his favorite cities to work in. Something about the blend of history and innovation resonated with his approach to music production. As first-class passengers began to disembark, Thomas appeared at his seat. Mr. Williams, I wanted to personally thank you again for your understanding throughout this flight. Big Shaq stood, retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. No need for thanks. It turned into something unexpectedly meaningful. Thomas smiled. That's a generous way to look at it. Rebecca asked me to give you this. He handed over a sealed envelope. She's already started her preparation for the return flight to Chicago tonight, but wanted you to have this before you left. Big Shaq took the envelope, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Make sure she gets my contact information before I leave, for her nephew's sake. Already done, Thomas assured him, and I've arranged for our VIP service to escort you through immigration, Mrs. Chen insisted. Though he typically declined such special treatment, Big Shaq was running tight on time for his first studio session. I appreciate that. Thank you. As he made his way off the plane, Big Shaq nodded goodbye to Diane, who smiled warmly. Just before the exit, he paused. Rebecca was in the galley preparing service items for the next flight. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small, genuine smile, no longer the polite professional mask she had worn when he first boarded, but something real and changed. He returned the smile with a small nod of acknowledgement. No words were necessary. They had already said what mattered. In the terminal, a young woman in an airline uniform was waiting with a small sign bearing his name. Mr. Williams, I'm Charlotte, your VIP liaison. If you'll follow me, we'll have you through immigration in no time. As promised, the expedited service had him outside the terminal within 20 minutes. While his driver loaded his luggage into the waiting car, Big Shaq finally opened the envelope Thomas had given him. Inside was a handwritten note on airline stationery. Mr. Williams, thank you for turning what could have been just another unpleasant encounter into a moment of growth and reflection for me. Our conversations have made me reconsider not just how I treat passengers, but how I've approached my own past and family. I've already spoken with my sister this morning about Kevin's music. She cried when I told her about your workshop program. It's been too long since I've been home, and I'm making plans to visit next month during my scheduled time off. If your offer still stands, I would be honored to volunteer at the workshop, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone still learning how to see beyond first impressions. With sincere gratitude, Rebecca. P.S. I contacted HR this morning to request cultural sensitivity training for our entire crew. Thomas thought it was an excellent idea and is supporting my proposal. Big Shaq read the note twice before carefully folding it and returning it to the envelope. As his car pulled away from the terminal, heading into the heart of London, he felt that rare satisfaction that came from knowing something good had emerged from a difficult moment. His phone buzzed, with a message from his assistant. Studio booked from 11 a.m. Andy's already there setting up. Says the young artist arrived an hour early, too nervous to wait at his hotel. Big Shaq smiled at that. Nervous energy often produced the best sessions. Tell them I'll be there in 30, he replied. He turned his attention to the city passing by outside the window, the morning light filtering through clouds to illuminate historic buildings alongside modern skyscrapers. The contrast reminded him of his conversation with Rebecca, how different their paths had been despite starting from similar places. 3 days later, Big Shaq was back at Heathrow, this time departing from Terminal 5 for his flight to New York. The studio sessions in London had been incredibly productive. The young British artist had exceeded even his high expectations, bringing a fresh perspective to tracks that would likely define the next year in music. As he waited in the first-class lounge, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Mr. Williams? The voice was familiar, Rebecca's sister. This is Tanya. Rebecca gave me your number. I hope it's okay to call. Of course, he replied, moving to a quieter corner of the lounge. How can I help you? I just wanted to thank you personally. My son Kevin, he hasn't stopped talking about the workshop since I told him he might have a chance to attend. He's been locked in his room for 2 days straight working on tracks to send you. Big Shaq could hear the emotion in her voice, a mother watching her child find his passion. I'm looking forward to hearing what he creates. It's more than that, Tanya continued. Rebecca and we haven't really been close since she left Chicago. But we've talked more in the past 3 days than in the last 5 years. She's coming home next month, staying with us for a week. The ripple effects of that confrontation on the plane were spreading further than Big Shaq had imagined. I'm glad to hear that. She told me what happened on that flight, Tanya said, her tone growing serious. How she treated you at first and how you responded. I wanted you to know that's not who my sister really is. Life just hardened her in some ways. Life does that to all of us, Big Shaq replied. The question is whether we let those hardened parts define us. Well, whatever you said to her made a difference. She sounds more like the Becky I grew up with than she has in years. Tanya paused. She mentioned you might come to Chicago for this workshop thing? That's the plan. Late next month. If you have time, and I know you're busy, but Kevin and I would love to have you over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked thank you. The invitation touched him more than she could know. Beyond the glamour and business of the music industry, these human connections were what gave his work meaning. I'd like that very much, he said sincerely. After ending the call, Big Shaq checked his email one last time before boarding. There was a message from the airline's customer relations department, acknowledging receipt of his statement about the incident. The formal language couldn't hide the surprise that seemed to permeate the message. Clearly, they hadn't expected him to specifically request that no disciplinary action be taken against Rebecca. The final paragraph caught his attention. We are pleased to inform you that based on your input and flight attendant Rebecca Taylor's own accountability, this incident has been transformed into a training opportunity. Ms. Taylor has volunteered to help develop content for our enhanced cultural sensitivity program, drawing from her personal experience. We believe this positive outcome would not have been possible without your extraordinary grace and wisdom in handling the situation. A boarding announcement interrupted his reading. As Big Shaq gathered his things, he reflected on how differently this could have played out. One angry word from him, one complaint demanding consequences, and Rebecca's career might have been damaged. Instead, something constructive had emerged, not just for her, but potentially for an entire airline's approach to passenger interactions. On board the flight to New York, he settled into his seat and closed his eyes, thinking about the tracks he'd produced in London and the new artists he'd be working with in the coming months. But his mind kept returning to Kevin, the nephew he hadn't met yet, creating beats on an old laptop in Chicago. How many other young people were out there with talent and passion but no pathway forward? The thought stayed with him as the plane took off, climbing through London's clouds into clear blue sky. By the time the seatbelt sign dinged off, Big Shaq had opened his tablet and started drafting a new proposal. An expansion of the workshop program to include not just equipment and instruction, but mentorship opportunities with industry professionals. At the core of his concept was a simple idea born from his experience with Rebecca. Sometimes the most powerful connections form when people move beyond their first impressions and find the courage to see each other clearly. 6 weeks later, Big Shaq stood in the back of a converted gymnasium in Chicago's South Side, watching 20 teenagers hunched over production equipment that would make most professional studios envious. The energy in the room was electric, the unique buzz that came from young people discovering their own creative power. Among them was Kevin, Rebecca's nephew. His focus intense as he worked on a beat that blended traditional soul samples with innovative electronic elements. The kid had real talent, an intuitive understanding of rhythm and space that couldn't be taught. He reminds me of you, said a voice beside him. Rebecca had arrived an hour earlier, still in her airline uniform after flying in from Los Angeles. She'd come straight from the airport to see the workshop in action. Higher compliment than you know, Big Shaq replied with a smile. How does it feel to be back? Rebecca took in the room. The kids from her old neighborhood working with technology and opportunities she couldn't have imagined when she was their age. Different than I expected. Better. She watched her nephew for a moment longer. Tanya says dinner's at 7. She's making her famous pot roast. Wouldn't miss it, Big Shaq assured her. As the workshop continued around them, they stood in comfortable silence. Two people from the same city but different worlds, whose paths had crossed in an unexpected way at 37,000 feet. What had begun with judgment had transformed into understanding, and from that understanding, new possibilities had emerged. Later that evening, as Big Shaq sat at Tanya's dinner table, surrounded by food, conversation, and laughter, he thought about the jewelry he still wore, the chains and rings that had triggered Rebecca's initial reaction. Each piece still told a story of his journey, but now they were part of a larger narrative, one that included an uncomfortable confrontation on a flight to London and the unexpected connections that had grown from it. Some might call it coincidence, others fate. Big Shaq preferred to see it as a reminder, That when we look beyond surface judgments, we often discover the most meaningful connections in the places we least expect to find them.